was trying to assimilate. I was trying to survive. And so my whole life has been about almost like looking at everything as algorithms and never sticking with one for too long, always disrupting them, always trying new ones on. I think all I'm really doing is I'm looking at the algorithms. And when I mean algorithms, you could call them habits, you could call them patterns. I'm sort of deconstructing the patterns. There's so many things that I feel like I can control. And or if I can't, there's things I can do to better control, you know, my attention, like the way I eat, the way I sleep. Like there's so many things I can kind of change up. But when we suffer a setback or failure, a challenge, it's just devastating.
There really is nothing worse than feeling hopeless, that a problem, it's too great and maybe you can't see or you don't think there's a solution. So whether you have a chronic illness or maybe you're just caught in an endless cycle of starting new diets and workout regimens, but really only to give up just after a couple of weeks. I really do understand. I don't have it in that direction, but I have it in some other areas of my life. And I find that getting out of that state of hopelessness is incredibly difficult when I'm there. And so for me, when I'm feeling hopeless, I know it's really time to challenge my own assumptions. I need to confront my mindset to see, hey, is there a different way, more empowering way to look at the problem? And whenever I get real with myself about that, that's when I personally have a breakthrough, which is why I asked Jeff Karp to join me today on the podcast. He's a biomedical engineer and professor of medicine at Harvard. And in his new book, Lit, Life Ignition Tools, he provides real strategies for energizing our brain and challenging our base assumptions. I know I could definitely use that. Welcome to the Gabby Reece Show. Let's go. Jeff Karp, welcome to the show. Thank you for, you're coming all the way from Boston. I know you have other things.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for setting this up like so quickly and inviting me into your home and serving me lunch, gluten-free style. Hey, wow.
It's selfishly motivated. I need you to focus. And I have to say, getting ready for this, yes. There's nothing like you're getting ready to do an interview with somebody who's one of their superpowers is that they have ADHD and they talk about how they had challenges in school and they don't want to sit in something too long. Their mind wanders. And I'm like, awesome, let's do a 75-minute interview. So that's my favorite is how do we dip in and out and, not go down, sort of big holes on things. But let's start. I want to start with you first. So I mentioned earlier, you've been at Harvard, MIT. So it's safe to say that you figured out, I think based on a conversation maybe with a teacher, what did you think about something?
How did you think about that? Yeah, in between the second and third grade, a tutor asked me that question, which I'd never been asked before, and it changed my life.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of people who struggle either with ADD or ADHD, and so you've written this book, Lit, and I want to get into it, Life Ignition Tools. But before that, I want to focus on something. I'm speaking to somebody who knows you very well and is close to you, because I always think what's forward-facing about a lot of people is not their magic or what the obvious things that are produced. It's actually from this quiet magic corner that all of these great things happen. Like you have invented many things. Maybe you could just share some of the things from your lab and from working with others that you've worked on, some of the things that you've invented.
I'd be happy to. One of the things we invented is a surgical glue that we demonstrated could seal holes inside a beating heart. And that glue we got regulatory approval for in Europe for vascular reconstruction. And it's in 2 clinical trials now, one for nerve reconstruction and one for hernia repair. And in the journey of that project, we ran into a lot of walls because getting a glue to work inside a beating heart, it's like probably the hardest environment in the human body where a glue would need to work.
Because it's moving.
Because it's moving, because it's expanding and contracting, because you have the rush of blood, 60 times a minute. and everything is covered in blood. The tissue is covered in blood. So we had to find a way to get the glue to attach strongly to the tissue and not just to the blood, like the cells that were, sitting there on the tissue. So we turned to nature for inspiration.
What inspired you in nature? Was it something to do with plants opening and closing, or I'm just curious?
We looked at a lot of, what happened first was, so usually for us to take a bio-inspired approach, what happens is we're advancing on a project and then we hit a wall and we try all sorts of different things and nothing works. And by that point, we start to better understand the problem. We start to sort of gain some insights. The insights might be just that we're thinking about this completely the wrong way and we don't know how to think about it, which is really a key insight. So what we do is then we say, okay, what creatures exist in nature that might teach us something? And so if you look at, like, let's say sandcastle worms that sit on rocks and the waves are constantly hitting them and they're not moving, how does that work? Because that's a very wet, dynamic environment. And there's other creatures like that too. Like sometimes you'll see like a snail sitting on a leaf and it's raining and it's not falling off. So how is it sticking there? And so we started looking at the secretions and the mechanisms that are used in nature to affix creatures to surfaces under wet, kind of moving environments, dynamic environments. And we learned a few things and then brought that back to the lab, and it led us to try things we hadn't tried before. And lo and behold, it enabled us to make progress where, many on the team thought we couldn't make more progress.
How do you abandon, because I feel like this is true of beliefs as a person, where, you could work on something for maybe years and be like, oh, we've been looking at it all wrong. Has this process made you more nimble at sort of going, I'm going to actually scrap everything and be willing to be open to look at it completely differently? Because I think that's almost one of the most difficult things to do as a person.
Yeah, I would say science is very difficult, and just in general, like literally like 9 out of 10 experiments, maybe even more, fail. And I think the trick that I've learned when you kind of submerge yourself in that environment, from the outside, you'd be like, oh my God, how could I do that? And, that's not for me. But to me, it's the journey of gaining insights and understanding and the little incremental learnings that you get along the way that really is the fuel to keep going. And so the nice thing about generally academic research is that there's no pressures other than, you need to bring in grants to fund the research. And that's challenging too, but there's, over time you can get better at writing grants by listening to the feedback that you get from the rejections. And and there's you don't know whether something's going to take a year or 10 years. But what you know is that by surrounding yourself with people from different disciplines and who think differently, and when you hit a challenge, you bring somebody new in who thinks about the problem a little bit differently, you can constantly be excited about what you're doing, even when you're not certain you're going to get to a final goal, because the focus is on that incremental learning and gaining insights. And I think that humans are just powered to thrive on that. Yeah,
the many little wins and possibilities. And actually, I think that's a better way when everyone goes, oh, the journey, it's not the, destination, it's the journey. It's a version of that, but with these sort of incredible learning and expanding opportunities on these paths. So we have Heart Blue.
Okay, yeah. So we got one. Okay.
And there's a hearing.
Yeah. We developed in the lab, we discovered a couple molecules in combination that could activate the progenitor cells in the inner ear to divide and form new hair cells. Now, the hair cells are really important because you're only born with about 10 to 15,000. in each ear, and this is in the inner ear. So it's actually, you have to go past two membranes to get there. There's the tympanic membrane that people know, the eardrum, but then there's another membrane, the round window membrane, which is the entrance to the cochlea, which is this shell-shaped structure in the ear that contains these precious hair cells. And it's not like hair on our heads. It's actually like these little cilia, and when the sound hits them, they move, and then the cell converts that into an electrical signal that goes to a neuron and then to the brain. And so over time, just by the aging process, these cells start to die. And so you can lose your hearing just by getting old, which is called presbycusis. But you can also lose it from certain drugs. So there's drugs like cisplatin, a drug for treating tumors, can kill hair cells. Certain types of antibiotics can kill hair cells. And then sudden noises can kill the hair cells as well. And the amazing thing is, if we look at nature, birds and amphibians like frogs and toads can constantly regenerate their hearing throughout life, but mammals like humans can't. But what we know is, when we kind of looked at this problem, we realized that the progenitor cells, the cells that can make the hair cells, are still there all the way. Like, we know this from cadaver kind of, experiments. We know that they persist throughout life. So even if you lose your hearing, you still have these progenitor cells, kind of like a stem cell.
So where's the breakdown in the translation? Or where does that, because if the hair is there, where are we breaking down?
So so that's a great question. So where the breakdown happens is that it's almost like, you can think of the progenitor cells as like the stem cell that can make more hair cells, these crucial special cells, but the hair cells die and they go away. So now you can't sense or amplify the signals. And so we discovered a couple molecules that could cause this stem cell or progenitor cell to divide. It never divides after birth. We got it to divide and form new hair cells. And so we took that into 5 clinical trials, and a number of patients who had stable hearing loss for months and months, their hearing got better. The results of that were not significant enough for us to bring it to patients as a new therapy. So we brought it back into the laboratory, and now we're using this new AI technology that we have access to identify another target that we can then identify a molecule we can add to the cocktail that we're developing and go back into trials.
It feels like you really have a relationship with going back to nature or biomimicry as a way to in your lab. I love the idea of biomimicry, because we sort of really realize, like, in so many ways, nature has it really so many things figured out, even the fact that left alone, there's no waste, right? That it's sort of this perfect system. Have you always had that thought or consideration, even in your studies and everything, of nature?
Well, when I was in the 3rd grade, we moved out to the country, and I'm talking like really out to the country. So
in Canada?
In Canada,
they got a lot of country in Canada, right?
We got a lot of land. Non-developed lands. There's a lot of beautiful spots there, and so, I wake up in the middle of the night, there'd be a pack of wolves on the front lawn. My driveway, we call the laneway because it was 1,000 feet long. It went over a creek that had crayfish and snapping turtles and leeches, and we had foxes and owls and all kinds of things. And I would get off the bus in the 3rd grade, kind of, I had undiagnosed ADHD and learning differences. And so I spent a lot of my life just trying to fit in, to try and figure out, like, what are the algorithms that people are living that allows people to connect and to learn and to function in school. And so I really had to work hard at trying to figure it all out. So I'd get off the bus and I'd be exhausted, maybe demoralized on certain days. And as I walked along the laneway, I would look at the trees. There were no cell phones. There was no real kind of portable technologies that I would carry around. So I would look at the texture of the bark on the trees and the animals, and it just captivated me. And it was almost like I felt like nature was hugging me as I was walking home. And the thought often, I'd get off the bus and kind of be ruminating on what happened during the day. And there was I felt this shift occur as I took more and more steps along, on my journey through this. Literally, the driveway was carved through a forest. And I think to your point, the process of evolution is an experimental process. It's constantly, it's iterative. There's trial and error. There's learnings and insights. There's adaptations. And so every single creature that's alive today is here because it has overcome insurmountable challenges along the way. And so there's so much to learn from every single creature, every plant that exists today. There's so many solutions, around us. In my lab, we look at those as ideas for solving problems. And I think one of the considerations kind of where we are in this current state of being in our culture is a lot of creatures are becoming extinct, which we are causing, but we can collectively, kind of group together and prevent the destruction of these creatures, which we can learn from and be more connected to. Because I think that, when we start to study creatures and the various adaptations that they have evolved over time, it just fires up our curiosity, and we have more appreciation for nature and gratitude for everything.
Mm. So you also brought the spray, Profi, is that right?
Profi spray.
Profi, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just going to kind of dibble dabble on all of the things that you've been doing, because there's a lot. So Profi is is it this idea of in lieu of a mask, or, because let's face it, I'm we're many years into this now. The masks don't work. Yes, if I coughed into your mouth and I was sick, that would be good if I had a mask on, or you had a mask on. But short of that, or doctors really after 15 minutes and all the things. So we're not debating masks. This was was this inspired by maybe people wearing masks or needing masks, or just kind of where we're at?
Well, what happened was, so when COVID hit and everything shut down, the lab shut down, we asked this question, how can we help in every single project? And we were developing a nasal spray to treat multiple sclerosis. And the nasal lining, there's a lot of immune cells in the nasal lining, so we can target them if we have a nasal spray. And then also the nasal lining is such that if we deliver drugs via a nasal spray, we can get drugs into the bloodstream very quickly, actually much faster than taking a pill. So there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to try to develop a nasal spray. So we had made a lot of progress on that, but then COVID hit, and we asked, how can we help? And the data was coming in, and some previous reports, as well as some current experiments that were being performed, that COVID spreads in droplets, and these droplets can stay in the room for long periods of time after someone leaves the room, all different sizes. And that the nasal lining was a major entry point for COVID. There's these cells that produce mucin or mucus called goblet cells, that they have receptors for COVID to anchor and take hold. And so actually for a lot of airborne pathogens, the nasal lining is a major site of entry. There was also a really interesting report that came out that showed that when COVID anchors into the nasal lining and it starts dividing, the virus infects the cells in the lining, but then those cells start budding off these little vesicles that then you can inhale and it can go into your lungs. And that may be one of the reasons why often when you have a nasal cold, it spreads to your lungs, because viruses have all kinds of nifty ways of hijacking our biology. And so we started to think, okay, what if we could develop a nasal spray that could form a barrier to prevent the the virus from entering, from contacting the nasal lining? What if that same coating could efficiently capture the droplets to prevent them from going, kind of further into our system? And what if we could also have agents within that spray that would neutralize pathogens, not just COVID, but we're talking like RSV and the flu and other things as well. And then I've learned some pretty hard lessons along the way in taking let's say advancing scientific discoveries, but trying to turn them into products that can help people, realizing how important simplicity is. And
you mean as far as how to administer it, or just across the board, ingredients? Everything.
Yeah. So it's sort of like, I had this one experience where, this is very ADHD. So, I mean, I have ADHD.
You're doing great.
I'm all over the place. So, when I started my lab, one of the first projects that I worked on was taking stem cells out of the body, manipulating them outside, and then having there was this project where we would infuse them intravenously and being able to target them in the bloodstream to different tissues. And we had data showing that we could do this, that we could literally target cells after you systemically administer them. So you could envision if you had cells that could create bone, you could target osteoporosis with just a simple intravenous infusion, target the cells to the heart to treat myocardial infarction and prevent, heart failure from happening, or to the brain. And I was certain this was going to be a company and we were going to help so many people. It was the first major project in my lab. Night before I was meeting with this big investor, I couldn't sleep. And then the next day I go in, I present, I'm kind of nervous, but I'm like, I feel like I got it in the bag. And the investor leans over and says, Jeff, this is really great, but we're going to pass. And the reason was the technology we had developed was too complicated, and it was just like a product of the algorithm that we submerge ourselves in academia of not really paying attention to the complexity of things. In fact, there's almost like this unwritten rule that the more complicated something is, and if you achieve it, the higher the impact, the better the journal you get into, the more excited people are. And so I'm sort of bypassing the frustration of that moment, because this was the first.
What do you do? Because I'm sure you're working on this tirelessly for long periods of time, sacrificing elements of your life. I imagine even there's been times where you're probably extended in all ways, even, financially, all the ways that we get extended. When he's like, hey, this is great and we're going to pass.
Yeah.
What's that night look like, that night of sleep? What does that dinner conversation look like with your wife? Like, where do you go as the person? Because the thing is, as somebody who is not built like this at all, I'm not, there's something kind of so rudimentary in a way about me that I think people think that you wouldn't be necessarily associated with all the feelings and the disappointments and the worry. It's like, oh, well, they're so smart, they'll just think their way out of it. So where do you go in the heart part of you when that kind of disappointment shows up?
Well, I think it becomes a moment where the emotions just can't be controlled. And that ends up being really challenging because, I think when, let's say, if I haven't just suffered a major defeat or challenge, there's so many things that I feel like I can control, in my day, and there, or if I can't, there's things I can do to better control, my attention, like the way I eat, the way I sleep, like there's so many things I can kind of change up. But when we suffer a setback or failure, a challenge, is something like what I mentioned with this investor, it's just devastating, because that was the first major project in my lab. I'd put like everything into it, and my, I had trained in very entrepreneurial labs and where people were spinning things out all the time, and I just felt like this was a win, and it wasn't, and so that kind of took me to this place. But what I realized, this kind of negative place, but what I've realized from encountering so many times is that after a good night's sleep or two, that there's almost like this kind of like after the rain moment where you can then look at your mind is open to examine things that you are not able to examine when you're at this pendulum swing of emotions, and start looking at things kind of differently. And I started to realize, I was like, wait a moment, here I am at the beginning of my career. And what if I just simplified everything? And that's where this concept of radical simplicity was born. And that term to me was important because it's short, easy to remember, easy to bring to every project in the lab. And that's what we did, is that we made it like guardrails for everything we did from then onward. And to me, that it's like those moments of failure. Like I can tell you, like when I went up on the TEDMed stage at the Kennedy Center in DC with 5 high-def cameras filming me, and I stopped in the middle for like 20 seconds, not saying a word, just standing there on the stage, smiling because they told us to smile if you stop. There's so many things like that have happened. Or like the first 100 grants I wrote for my lab, 90 something were rejected, to the point where I would come home, my wife would say, she said this once, she said, "Are you sure this is the right career for you?" Which I kind of feel maybe in some ways motivated me a little bit more, being like, I think, but what I realized with each one of those grant rejections is, even though it felt like I was being punched in the face and I had that emotional pendulum swing that I couldn't control, like I really wanted to bring that pendulum over, but there was no way it was going to happen unless I just got a good night's sleep or two. And when that pendulum started to come back, I realized that was a moment I could actually look at what the reviewers had said about my grant without sort of thinking nasty things about them in my mind, right? Like how crazy they were.
Well, they don't even know. They're not even as smart as you guys. No, I mean, they're money guys. What do they know?
Yeah, the reviewers, it's kind of, it's an interesting conversation.
So it's safe to say you have 12, am I in the right part? About 12 things that you've created that have... Yeah. So you have done a lot. And so I was thinking about you, and there are some of the immediate things that showed up for me before we get into lit was, but what is really the thing that we're not seeing that is kind of the unique trait? And so I decided I was going to call a friend of yours because... I have this sometimes with Laird. People think the most interesting thing about Laird is sort of some of this obvious stuff. It's actually not the case for me. And so I called Zem. And what Zem said, and this is how we met, is she's like, he's a genuine solutionist. For real. And that there's actually so few. Right? She talked about Dean, what's Dean's name?
Dean Kamen.
Yeah. Who invented... what's funny is I know him through almost like dirt biking and BMX. Do you know he had a love for that? I mean, he created the Segway.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of old school guys that actually knew him. I want to say Pennsylvania. I could be really wrong. But there was sort of like a movement that started in dirt BMX biking. And anyway, there was a sort of a connection there. But that she thinks that your ADHD... along obviously with your brilliance, is it allows you to almost be around the corner, that you see solutions to things. And she said that it's so unique, and there's a lot of people who maybe they act like they're solving problems or they're inventing things or they're inventive, but that people don't realize that you really are doing that. And so I think there's a lot of people living with things where they don't fit into the way the regular world works, right? That the majority of us are doing. And then there's people like you who they're like, oh, well, why I should try to fit in. But I actually think the better conversation is, which led me to my next thought about you, which is we as a world, with the combination of technology, with the increase of for whatever the myriad of reasons are, there's more people on a different spectrum, right? That you have this interesting combination. Yes, you're here to solve problems and invent things and help society, but also you have this interesting merge of seeming disconnected in a certain way, like very intellectual and intellectualizing things and compartmentalizing, but yet completely aware that you need to be connected to nature and your biology. Because I feel like you either have people like me who are like, hey, let's not ignore our biology, or people who are just, technocrats and talking about data and they're in their boxes all day long. And you have this interesting thing besides inventing and creating solutions as being this very unusual person who kind of connects to both. So I wondered if lit was also, and I know lit was supposed to be one kind of book, right? Yeah, and then maybe your life sort of pointed out to you that it should be something else.
Yeah.
So was this book one of your ways of trying to do that?
Well, actually, before answering that, I want to just reflect for a moment on what you said before, because I feel like what I do, everybody can do. I think that, and the reason why I feel that way really strongly is that I think all that I'm really doing, and I'm just sort of like stream of thought here, right? I think all I'm really doing is I'm looking at the algorithms. And when I mean algorithms, you could call them habits, you could call them patterns. I'm sort of deconstructing the patterns. And so so when I see, like, let's say the standard approach in academia, for example, is you're working on something, you go to a conference, you learn something, you come back and you just add it to what you're doing. And then I look at that and I say, okay, but what's the goal? If the goal is to help a patient, is that really going to help? And so I see that there's a tendency to be incremental. You read something, you see something, and you just sort of add it to what you're doing because no one's ever added these two things together. But then I'm sort of like looking at it and saying, okay, well, what's the ultimate goal? We're trying to help a patient. We're trying to define a problem. So I'm just focused on the problem definition and continually chipping away at that problem definition and trying to make sure that the project is angling towards that definition as we iterate it. But what that's why I think everybody can do what I'm doing. I think that when I was younger and when I was struggling with this undiagnosed ADHD and learning differences, and eventually got diagnosed because my mom's a warrior and went up against the school system, and the teachers, nobody wanted to do anything. And she literally went to the Board of Education herself with this massive file on everything that anyone had ever said or written about me, and got me identified. But I needed to develop tools for survival because I felt like I was almost like, kind of looking back, I was like if you think of the computer analogy, I had the hardware, but I didn't have the software. And I needed to, through experiential, interactions, like my experiences, I had to learn and try out. I looked at how other people behaved, and then I behaved that way and would see how that felt and where that got me. And then I would look at someone else and I would try that on. Anytime someone had an opinion, I would take that opinion on as my own opinion. I'd bring it up in a conversation, see what the reactions were, and then I would change the opinion based on the reactions to try to figure out, because I was trying to fit in, I was trying to assimilate, I was trying to survive. And so my whole life has been about almost like looking at everything as algorithms and sort of and never sticking with one for too long, always disrupting them, always trying new ones on. And so that's why I feel people can, I think anybody can do it. It's just a path. Like it's a process. It's not necessarily wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to be able to do it, but you can get on the path of doing it. You can start to observe the patterns, sort of almost like kind of meta, like where you start to watch other people's behaviors. Like one example, so I'll give you an example on questions. I want to get back to your question too, so let me know if
I'm good.
Okay. So,
you can't shake me, Jeff.
Okay, I'm not trying. But so when I got to grad school, I thought I was really good at asking questions, because I had learned when I was in between the second and third grade, and the teacher or the tutor asked me, how did you think about that? And that question all of a sudden I had this new awareness of thinking about thinking, and that allowed me to bring this new awareness everywhere. And that's where I started to look at patterns in my own thinking and in other people. I started to realize anytime I asked a question, I could hyper focus for a few moments afterwards on whatever was said, right? I feel everybody can do that, by the way. Like when you ask a question, it's like there's something special about it just for a really short amount of time afterwards. Like because you're like, you're connected. It's like almost like it's a way to connect with somebody in a really special way. And so I realized then what was said in that brief moment after the question that I asked, that would imprint in my mind. I could recall it later. I could connect it to other things that I knew. And so I realized one of my survival skills was to ask questions. When I got to University of Toronto and I went to these invited lectures, that's what you do as academics, you go to invited lectures, and I'm not really paying attention. Then the question and answer period occurs, and it was like people were asking the most amazing questions, but they weren't coming to me. And I started to think like, I thought I was really good at asking questions, and here I was about to learn like a whole new level of question asking. And what I was trying to figure out, so I started to shame myself. Like that's like sort of like it, these things trigger me to sort of start like.
You mean like, why didn't I think of that?
Why didn't I think of that question? Why is that question not coming to me? How come it's coming to them and not me? Like these are amazing questions and I'm not thinking of any of them, not one. And so what I did was I started to think about pattern recognition, because I had been doing a lot of pattern recognition. And the next seminar I went to, everybody was focused on what the speaker was saying, but I was focused on something completely different. I was focused on the questions people were asking at the end of the seminar. And I literally wrote them all down for weeks, for like 2 or 3 months.
So is that how you would put it together, is through the question?
So yeah, well, what happened is that as I was writing the questions down, I got, let's say 2 or 3 months later, I started to look them over, and I realized there were patterns to the questions. Each question that was asked could fit under like 4 or 5 different categories. And like, was the experiment working? There were a whole bunch of questions like that. Were the results important? There were a lot of like, if someone was developing a diagnostic for blood and they did all their experiments in saltwater saline and they showed amazing results, it may not work in blood. So, but people get excited, but then, someone put up their hand and say, what about blood? Oh no, I didn't test it there yet. And then all of a sudden it's not as exciting. So there were all these questions. And so the next seminar I went to, I was like hyper focused. I was really excited. I had my detective hat on. The questions other people were asking were now coming to me because I saw the rationale behind the questions. I started, so this was literally like my window into how questions are a skill that I can develop and get better, regardless of where you're at. Anybody, you can hone your ability to ask high value questions and get better and better and better at it, just like anything. And so I brought that to social settings, because there's always in a social setting someone who's like a schmoozer, someone who's really good at connecting with other people. So I start listening in. What are the questions they're asking and how are they asking them? And then I can experiment with that and I can get better at connecting with people through. So that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that like, I feel like anybody can get better at asking questions, which when you ask high value questions, that's how you do the most impactful work in everything. And then when connecting with people as well, it's about the questions. And I find personally through experimenting that it's what I've observed, and with myself as well, is that when I ask questions about things I'm genuinely curious about, then that leads to the deepest connections with the people that I'm interacting with, But
you said, so on the academic, that makes perfect sense. On the human, you've been in a very long relationship with your wife, Jessica. You have 2 teenagers. So there's ways that, how like there are people very good at this, like they know how to make other people feel good, but they're sort of in there themselves. So it's you connecting with them. And in what scenarios is someone connecting with you? Are they reaching you? Are they touching you? Because it feels like you know, for me personally, it's like I sort of have these feelings and my opinions. And of course, it's all a made up, you know, matrix of input that I've had and, you know, all these things that, why do I think that or believe that? But at what point, and maybe it's your daughter, I don't know, or your wife, where they're asking you a question and it's only about you. It's not about your studying of algorithms or how people are working, but it's just about the you that's here. How did you develop that? Because it feels like when you're young, you go, hey, maybe that's not working. So I'm going to figure out how to make it work, because I know a lot of people experience this. So then they figure out ways to be in the world to make it work. But then at what point do we have the way to come right back to our authentic self? How do you find that within all of your assessing and reading of algorithms and going, well, that works, and that it's you?
Yeah. Wow. What a question. I think what really just comes to mind is that I'm in touch with the cues that I get from my body and my mind and my interaction with others. And I'm also in touch with when I'm not getting those cues. So, because I don't always get the cues because I'm so like focused on my work, or, you know, I'm so busy, or there's something happening, I'm stressed or I have anxiety or whatever, certain situations. And, but then usually what happens if I'm not accessing the cues in a particular moment, they'll hit me at some point, like when my head hits the pillow, or, you know, certain times in the day when I'm, let's say, taking the dogs for a walk. There's times that, and I think that we're almost like in this, we have this culture where we're taking our phones into the bathroom with us, and when we're on walks, and I think that that those, I've discovered for me personally, that those are the moments when I usually receive cues, when I usually get insights on things, if my mind is like ruminating on a problem and it just doesn't, like, it's like the record's skipping at one point, like that's when it occurs, like in those moments. And so if I'm on my phone, then I don't get those cues. And so so there'll also be situations where I'll say something and I'm always reading reactions. In fact, sometimes my pendulum swings so far, like I'm giving a lecture and I'm like looking for cues as I'm going. And if I'm not getting the cues from the audience, I get very insecure that I'm not connecting, and I start thinking about what can I do to connect more. So sometimes I sort of interpret and overread things in certain situations, which can be quite
hard,
challenging. Yeah.
Well, so this is all makes a lot of sense for the work you do, and for, you know, I feel like we all are here and have a contribution and purpose, and it makes perfect sense for all of this amazing work you're doing in your lab. But let's say you're in an interpersonal moment and your wife's like, hey, or your daughter is like, are you listening? Or I'm making it up, or you don't understand, or you're, you know, like, what are the myriad of things that a teenage girl says? I mean, where do you find, so it's instantaneous, right? And so, okay, you're annoying, you're not listening, you don't hear me, whatever. Where do you go right then?
So one example, a few months ago, I was doing work, and my wife Jessica was in the car with my son Josh, who's 18, and they were driving somewhere, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to come. And I was doing work right before, and I jumped in the back seat, and I had my laptop open, and I'm like kind of working in the back seat as my wife's driving, and there was conversation going on, and I was kind of participating in the conversation a little bit. But I said something that I forget what I said.
You had a dad moment.
I said something and to my wife in the moment, and I was thinking it was more like not what I said, but like the tone of voice, the kind of, because I was working. And my son Josh turned around and just let me have it, you know, like just was, you know, he kind of stopped me in my tracks and said, stop that right now. There was something like that. And that immediately caused an emotional pendulum swing for me, right? Just instantaneous. And it brought me to the place of realizing that my actions weren't aligning with my values, my true intentions. And so I sort of like, it's almost like I felt my body get hotter. In that moment.
Oh, I know that.
Right?
I know that moment. But are you still observing it on some level? Even though you're having these, reaction, are you still more I'm fascinated because I'm pretty analytical. This is like a whole other level. Makes me feel like, or does it punch you straight in your heart?
It punches me straight in the heart. And I feel myself get defensive in the moment, wanting to trigger to like have like the ego, kind of
protect
yourself, right? Like, and say something back immediately. I used to do that a lot. Now I fight it so that it doesn't happen. It's definitely a fight, like it's not just like easy. It's not easy. And I reflect on it. And when that happens, like I'm reflecting on it for the rest of the day and maybe the next several days. And I'm, and also I'm trying to figure out, what can I change? What can I do? How did that happen? Maybe this is a cue that I've taken on too much. Maybe this is a cue that this is too about me, right? Because I think that we had, so in September of last year, a friend of mine, Josh Flash, came and stayed with me, with the family for 10 days. And the mission was to observe me and all of my patterns and to give me suggestions of how I could do better.
Whose idea was this?
So Josh,
you must really trust Josh.
Yeah. He's amazing. So we have a mutual friend, Michael Gale, and he had done the same thing with Michael, which had led to, and the three of us chat about all kinds of different things. And so, is he
kind of a fly on the wall, or does he get involved, or how is he involved there?
Yeah.
Like he has breakfast at the table with everybody, or dinner, or whatever with the family, or how's he doing it?
He prepares meals too,
oh,
right?
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's really, he was a chef, and so, but he he would say things to me like, everywhere you walk, I hear you stomping. I didn't know about that. And when he said that, and then he said, every time you walk, you accelerate, you walk really fast. And he would notice the multitasking that I would do, and he brought to my life, this one thing at a time. And not that I do that for everything, but it's in my mind now, this one thing at a time. And he would, I'd get to my son was quarterback of the football team, and I'd get to the football game with him, and I'd get out of the car, and he's like, get back in. We need to do breath work. We need to have a transition. You were just working. We need a transition here before you go to the game. And I'm like, but I hear the announcer, they're about to start. I can't miss it. He's like, no, shut the door.
Don't bring that energy.
Don't bring that energy.
Yeah.
And so that really was transformative for me, to try to understand that I need transitions, and kind of going back to the car moment, I needed a transition there. And I was too back to back, too focused on, I can just multitask and those two worlds just collide.
Yeah. So the other thing that jumped out at me, and just to kind of put a small circle in, does that make sense about what I was saying about we are moving into a world where at some level, if we don't have a general understanding of who we are just as kind of animals, our natural impulses that are built there to keep us to survive, right? Two things, survive and procreate. And that doesn't mean you have to procreate. It means it's pretty much a biological drive. But we do have a new world. How long it goes, I have no idea. Can you relate to that feeling of being of somebody who could be a beautiful thread between the two? Because listen, for example, I'll use Laird, who's a very kind of, integrated into nature person. We do have to teach him a little bit about technology so he can sort of flow through the world. Doesn't mean he's got to be perfect in AI and know how to do all these things. He doesn't have social media apps on his phone. He does use technology to communicate, to look at weather maps and other things as a tool, because it's like, hey, this is part of the world. Conversely, we can't go so deep into that world and not really defer back to our biology. So when I feel that, and it feels like in the book too, that you're sort of saying as deep as you could have the capacity. I mean, you say things like reading algorithms as patterns, that you're also saying, hey, I go and I take a box. So I felt that was actually beyond your inventions and your solutions. Another important thing that you represent, whether you know it or not, because there's a lot more people who are sort of probably going like, I'm really good inside this place and I feel anxious and I feel alone and I feel isolated and I don't feel good. And so I thought that was important. But the other thing that really jumped out for me is Jessica. I do see certain people, your wife, you're in a 20 something year.
Just celebrated 20 years.
Right.
Yeah,
so I always feel like I'm so fascinated by what it is Jessica does for you, because she probably goes, oh, I get you. I get your mission, because your mission's special and important and should be protected. It should be, because there's not many of you who can do it. Your intention, you're kind-hearted, you want to help people, you want to help patients. You move your lab to be near patients and closer in the action, right? But what are the things she does that you guys can be in this dynamic? Because it must be pretty extraordinary.
Yeah. No, I don't think I'm an easy person to live with.
Well, none of us are, just so we're clear. In all of our weirdness, all of us.
Yeah.
And cohabitation, even if you're the coolest, look at Justin sitting over here. He's so easy. It's it's a dance.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing I think is relevant. So Jessica attended this group for partners of people who have ADHD. And that was transformational for her, because I think the group was discussing all the things their ADHD partners do and say and how they react in certain situations, and the energy pendulum and the mood pendulum. And I think that she realized in that experience that it wasn't me trying to do it to her, that this was not my intention, but yet this was a pattern, of people who have ADHD and how they behave and interact. And I think one thing, so many things, first of all, let me say for Jessica, right? Like, she will call, she'll call our son Josh, like when he's coming home from football practice or wherever he was, and she'll just say to him, like, do you know how much I love you? Do you know how awesome you are? Do you know how much I care for you? But like every day she'll do that. And the same thing with Jordan as well, like the car rides to the school. And, Jessica just has a way of sort of diffusing situations when there's anxiety. Jordan, has anxiety about her makeup and things that she's doing.
Well, she's a teenage girl, man. It's a hard deal.
It's hard. Yeah, it's really hard. But Jessica has a way of just transmitting to the kids in a way that they just listen. They stop sort of in their tracks and they listen to the words that she's saying and they process it, and then they incorporate it into their lives, like into their thinking. And they, I mean, there's just so much I could say about Jessica.
But how do you ask Jessica out on a date? Like how does that even, like, how do you go, okay, here's Jessica. I'm attracted to her. I'm interested in her. I'm curious about her. Is it analytical? Is there some impulse? Is it like, hey, like where does that come from?
Well, I would say there's sort of like things have changed kind of over time in terms of how we spend our time together, right? And so I'd say now we're in a phase where the time we're spending together is with the children.
Sure.
And so that's where most of the time is. Our son Josh has an amazing girlfriend, Maya, and so last night we were all out for dinner together and just like trying to do as many sort of family things as we can because Josh is going off to college.
Right.
I would say.
But what about when you're trying to woo her?
When I'm trying to woo her, well, that's something that I really need to work on. That is something that I need to do better at.
Well, but listen, Jeff, you've done it well enough that she married you and has 2 children with you.
Yeah.
And I have to say that, I guess because again, a lot of people feel awkward or, uncomfortable. What do you think? Do you think you just showed her the you and then she was like, okay. I mean, because I think sometimes we think it has to be a whole dance. And sometimes when we just show our genuine selves, another person, that's it. That's what they need.
Yeah. No, I think for me, I have, so for example, let's say in the morning, right?
Yeah.
Before the kids have come down, I often have bursts of energy in the morning. And Jessica's a very stable, grounded person who has a very calm energy. Most of the time, almost all the time, I would say. Very calm, very grounded. She's a Pilates instructor. She has a Pilates studio. She is very dedicated to learning and doing better at Pilates. I mean, she's an unbelievable Pilates instructor. And she constantly training and, she's very much connected to mind, body. She's like deeply teaching other people about mind-body connection, where people have breakthroughs every day who she spends time with. And she has such wisdom from the heart space, where I feel my work kind of puts this kind of cloud sometimes around the heart space. And not that it's like, I feel I lead with my heart, but I don't always, I guess I don't always like act based on my heart, so there's this sort of like, I don't know. I mean, you're sort of getting at something that I'm really deeply trying to figure out and trying to.
It comes through in your book.
Yeah.
I feel it. And the thing it senses is like you're inspired by your heart, but maybe then you create a strategy around that.
Yeah.
And I actually relate in a different way to that. I do appreciate you grilling me. I just that I can grill you about this stuff. But I think a lot of people, maybe a parent might have a child, and it's like, hey, is a hug ever just the best thing for you? Like if she comes up to you and just is a hug like,
that's great. Yeah, I know. I love hugs.
It's because sometimes I think when somebody is their brain is working in a different way, you just want to find the ways to connect with them. What's the best way? Because it's not just about you connecting with me. It's me also wanting to connect with you.
Yeah.
Can we just add the checklist though? Can we talk about the biking checklist?
Sure.
In your garage? Yeah. I love that. Okay. Can you share? Because you like to walk the dogs, you go and you ride your bike.
Yeah.
You even have your bike helmet here. I love that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good riding here.
Oh yeah.
So there's a checklist, is there not?
I have a checklist. Sometimes I forget to look at the checklist.
You need to have a checklist to look at the checklist?
Yeah, I have a checklist that is in the garage on like a whiteboard that basically just says all the things that I need to check out, like, the tire pressure, the helmet, the goggles, the reflective ankle straps that I put on, the tools that I bring with me when I go, are the lights charged. There's a lot of things on that list. And even when I look at it, I sometimes miss things when I'm out on a ride and I'm just like, oh, I forgot to bring this or that. that. The bike lock, I took my bike out the other day and I didn't have a lock, and I was biked to a dinner. And so they had to let me bring the bike into they let me bring the bike into the restaurant, which is incredible. But I do have that checklist.
When you're at work and you're working on a new invention, new product, a new solution, because that's what you're working on better solutions. You probably don't need those checklists. I know that there's methodical steps when you're doing these processes, but is that much more fluid for you?
Much more fluid. And I think that's like the power of neuroplasticity, of kind of practicing something over and over again and sort of pushing the limits on it, but constantly, kind of repeating it, is that, and that's, to me, one of the things I started to reflect on a lot about the education system, is I started to realize that in school that the knowledge kind of slipped away from me, but but my instincts were developed. Like I had instincts about, problems and ability to break them into smaller subsets or to look at them from different angles. And then that can become automatic. And so we can actually use this wiring that we have so that our brains can do things very efficiently, and even, high level things we can start to do very efficiently. One of the people I interviewed in the book was Chris Hadfield, who is an astronaut from Canada, he did a bunch of space missions where he was, outside the space station, essentially, performing operations. And he said that he had to practice every single thing that he could, envisioning everything that could go wrong. He said there's like a sphere of things that can go wrong, and a smaller subset of that.
Right.
And he said he would practice those so he wouldn't have to think about it when he was in space, so that he could focus his attention on the things that he didn't were unexpected. Yeah. And I think that we can bring that to so many things. I want to actually just go back for a moment about, we were talking about family, and one thing that I realized and something that happened during COVID. So when COVID hit, my life came to came crashing down in my living room. I started to realize that I had become a workaholic, and that I needed to experience a different way of being. And I started to look around, try to figure out what to do. And Jessica had been engaging various spiritual leaders in the community, asking questions and just, having various interactions. And over time, I kind of was just thinking about it, and she would talk, and I would always process what she said. I don't know if she knows how deeply I am listening, because I'm sometimes not looking somebody in the eyes when I'm listening, but I'm sort of I'm processing it in a kind of a different way, because I'm sort of busy, my mind's kind of jumping around, and but I am sort of connecting it to things. And I started to realize that that's exactly what I needed. I needed to talk to the people that she was speaking to. So I asked her to introduce me, and that was transformational. And I started practicing meditation, transcendental meditation. Meditation had never worked for me before, and I kind of had to experiment with a few different types, apps and things, but I started to do the TM, and I started to realize that I had this experience when I was younger in college where I took magic mushrooms, such a dose that it was pretty significant dose, but where I had this experience where I could experience a thought entering my mind. It would stay there, and then it would leave, and another thought was kind of taking its place. And I was kind of and I could feel the emotions of the thought that was in my mind, but then I could also feel the emotions go away and this new thought enter, and the emotions change. And so when I started practicing meditation, it was a parallel to that. I experienced that, how I'd be meditating, saying this word over and over in my mind, and then a thought would come in. I'd have this emotional response. I'd want to get up and go do something. And then if I just was able to bring myself back to the word, then that thought would leave, but so would the emotion associated with it. And I started to bring that to my interactions with my family. And I realized there was almost like this energy of the conversation. So if I was, in a conversation with my son, I realized that if we're talking and he's saying something to me, that I have these impulses to pull out my phone and say, hey, look at this, or what about that, or to say something, to interject. And I realized that whenever I did that, it changed the energy from him to me. And then he would stop speaking. And I realized that wasn't my intention. My intention is to support him, to find his voice, to continue speaking, and for the energy to be on him, not me, because I've had enough energy on me, like it's his time to. And so that was really instrumental in helping me in all conversations to really feel that energy of the conversation and realize when I'm pulling it towards me, and to be asked, and then to ask myself, why do I need that energy at this moment, and what's the sort of consequence of me doing that? And now most of the time I do feel triggered to say something. I do feel like I need to interject, but I'm able now most of the time, not all the time, to just let it pass. And I feel like that's brought me closer with my family.
I think that's something, whatever level someone's at, that would be helpful. The art of listening or not reacting to our thoughts is a forever and ongoing thing that is helpful. It's interesting when you talk to somebody who you just came to the planet with a different kind of octane, to watch somebody where, in certain ways it's like, oh man, how easy for you. But then realizing also that there's sort of back-end work that's required to sort of drive that vehicle, that I think I really commend you for. I do want to say one thing, and then I want to bring up some points of the book, is you at some point, I think, stopped going to class in college, right? Because it just was not working for you.
I was too frustrated. I was angry. I couldn't follow along, even after I had been developing a variety of tools and things. It just wasn't working for me. So I stopped going, and I had to find a new way. Actually, one of the things that I did was, because I'm just experimenting with different ways to do things. And what I realized is that for, let's say, I was in engineering, a lot of it's math. And I realized that if I got the answers to the questions, that was a lot more exciting for me to study the answers and try to guess what the question was. And so by doing that, that's how I learned how to answer the questions, as I did it backwards. And that I also, for reading, I realized that if I start reading from the beginning, it's like I want to get to that. Like there's so much kind of fluff in writing that the main points, I want to get them right away. And so what I would do is I would start at the end of a chapter, read backwards, and then I'd be like, well, what's going on? I don't know. And now it's almost like problem-based learning. There's a problem because I've read something, I don't really understand it. Now I go and find the connection to, connect everything together.
So just streamline it in your own way to keep you engaged.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, I was kind of thinking and laughing. So LIT, Life Ignition Tools, it's a big book. And if people have ADHD or ADD, or maybe they don't have a lot of time, for you in this book, because you share your story so people really can understand that you've had a journey and you've had a lot to navigate. And you talk about, some core tenets. If you said, hey, if you were going to read one part of this book, one chapter, or one, sort of one thing for people who they're like, hey, listen, I can't read books. What really has shown up for you after finishing the book and sharing the book?
I'm trying to interpret your question. So like one chapter, one tool.
So there's the story of your journey, and then there's sort of some real takeaways. And I want to get into a couple things about how you pair, for example, living outside the box and pinching your brain, right? Those two things. But if you sort of thought, hey, I know this information inside and out, and if you really want to break it down to this
Right.
that you'd want to give to your fellow humans that navigate the world similar to you,
Yeah.
what is that?
To me, the biggest thing from the book is resensitizing our aliveness. It's how when you watch children play, you watch children in their element. They're just, I had this conversation with a friend of mine recently, Bridge, and we're just talking about birds and how kids look at birds and think they're magical creatures. But as soon as you say, as an adult, you say, oh, that's a bird, then you take the magic away. And to me, lit is resensitizing ourselves to that magic that's all around us, because there's just so many tiny things that we can do during our day to tap into this wellspring of energy and raise our ultimate baseline constantly to new levels. And I'll give you a bunch of examples. Like, one thing I do now is I walk around my neighborhood. This isn't in the book, but is an evolution of the tools from the book. I walk around my neighborhood. So I used to walk around the neighborhood with my phone like this, watching like HBO or Netflix with the two dogs. I'd go out for an hour walk, and then I justify to myself that I got exercise, they got exercise, and I was able to watch something, and I can talk to other people about it. And but what I realize is I'm completely missing something that is much a higher place, higher level, higher whatever. It was my connection to what's around me. And so I started doing a bunch of things. I set the intention. It never worked for me to set the intention of not using the device. It's like, because I kind of thought about it. It's like, when I was born, like, that wasn't an intention to not use technology. It just didn't make any sense to me. But if I set the intention, I want to connect with the dogs, right? Then if I'm on my phone, I can't connect with the dogs. So then what I start doing is I get over my insecurities of talking to them and interacting with them, because neighbors are seeing what I'm doing. And I notice one of the dogs looks back at me every minute and a half, another one every 5 minutes, and we make eye contact. And we both get this, like, one starts galloping whenever we make eye contact. And so, but now I sort of like pinch my brain on that. Like, I focus my attention. I think like, wow, like, what's happening there? Like, isn't this like, what, like, just bring my curiosity to that, like, what just happened? Like, we made eye contact. There was this exchange of energy. We're both feeling better because of it. Where else can I apply this? I started to experiment. I started to walk backwards sometimes with my dogs at night, so I could see them walking towards me. I was like, oh, like that, like, just, and their smiley face, different perspective. I started walking around my neighborhood, and I would focus on individual senses. I'd say sight, and I'd look at the bark of the trees and the tops of the trees and the clouds and the leaves. And then I'd say hearing, and I would listen for the birds and the other animals, or the rustling of the wind in the leaves. And I say touch, and I'd feel the clothes on my skin. I'd slow down and feel my heels hit the ground. And I started to practice that. And as I practiced it, I noticed that my gaze was more connected with what I was looking at. Like, I would walk by a tree, and before I did this, my eyes are going all over the place, almost like on a screen when you're looking at YouTube. Your kind of eyes I feel like our eyes are being trained to just jump around. And so I felt like I was doing that out in nature, but where I was getting the best connections, or the deepest connections, is when I could focus on something. And so I looked at the trees. Now I look at the trees, and it's like I walk by and I'm still looking at the tree, and I'm looking at the shape, and I'm looking at the texture, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm looking at the little plants that are growing on the side of the tree, and trying to think, like, where did they come from? And now I bought this microscope. Actually, I have it with me, but I bought this microscope, a little screen and a little tube, and you put it on things, and you can turn the focus knob and see the fractals of life, everything around us. Like, you can see another dimension that you don't typically see and so that I'm using that as a way to train myself to see behind everything. Like, when you interact with somebody, you don't know what they were just doing before. You don't know what they're experiencing in their life. You don't know, like, there's so much there. So to become more curious about everything. And to me, when I start doing that, like when I start eating, and every meal I have, like I try to close my eyes for a few bites, and that changes the experience. My wife's brother's children, we went out for dinner with them in Toronto actually like a month ago or so. And I said, they're like, I don't know, like 8 and 11 or something like that. And I said to them, hey, why don't you close your eyes just for a few bites, right? We were at the sushi restaurant and they close their eyes and they're like, oh my gosh, it's so different, right? Like, cause it's like all of a sudden you're focusing in, because we have all these stimuli coming at us from all angles, but the stimuli are sound and sight and touch, and it's like it's all over the place, right? And taste. And so if we can start to focus in on individual senses, what I've realized is that you can resensitize those senses, and it's through our senses how we experience the world. And so to me, that's what really lit is all about. That's the cornerstone of lit, is it's resensitizing our aliveness, and then also being open to all of these possibilities. Often we only see narrow range of possibilities, sometimes only one in any scenario, but there are so many ways to do things. And to me, that's the power of neurodiversity, of interacting with people who think differently and are from different places and have different experiences, is that we can uncover new possibilities that we can then experiment with or even just think about. And the contrast between what our way of being and our way of doing things and seeing other people do it helps us to realize whether what we're doing is really serving us or whether we should be experimenting to try new things.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point about those are the ways that we can really help each other. Is me understanding and learning about the way you do it and think, oh, I could borrow some of that. That would improve the way I do it, and not being afraid of that. So can we go, you mentioned pinching your brain, and it's a term you share in the book, but you do both very well. You pinching your brain, the sort of narrow focus, and then this idea of living outside the box. Have you gotten more fluid going in and out of these spaces, and was it just with a kind of awareness and practice?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Like I think that there's so many. Well, I mean, one thing that just jumps to mind is that, you know, and I went and checked it out. There's $900 billion spent on marketing and advertising every year to hijack our attention. 900 billion every year. And so that's like this massive force that we're up against. And in fact, I use that in sometimes as a way to sort of to not shame myself, right, for going and being distracted, because it's such a powerful force. How can you compete with $900 billion? And kind of actually going back to one of the other things you said earlier, I see us at this almost like this snapshot in evolution, right? Where we still have these animalistic, impulsive kind of wiring, but then we also have this wiring for consciousness. And I think that generally what we see in evolution is things that don't serve us kind of get evolved out over time. It can take hundreds or thousands, usually thousands of years, but we're at this snapshot where we're kind of have this interesting mix of consciousness. We have this amazing prefrontal cortex in our brain, the front part of our brain that's responsible for problem solving and decision making, emotional regulation. We have this amazing ability of neuroplasticity to intentionally, neuroplasticity is the rewiring of our brain that happens intentionally or non-intentionally. It's just constantly happening. So why not make it intentional and rewire your brain in ways that are going to be helpful to you and that align with your values and that can serve you. But the challenge is that we have this impulsive kind of animalistic wiring as well. And so unless we have a strategy, we're just going to be into this low energy brain state, where, you know, we were hunters and gatherers for tens of thousands of years, and we needed to be in this we needed to gravitate to a low energy brain state and body state because we were outside working hard to survive. And so we naturally gravitate to low energy and low body energy states today, but we can consciously get ourselves off the couch or wherever we are and out experiencing and exploring and engaging in all these incredible things in life. And I mean, I'll just give you a couple other kind of quick examples. Like one thing that I do now is like when I send an email and I don't get a response right away, I immediately am triggered to thinking, okay, I said too much, or a text, right? Like I said too much. I said the wrong thing. Like when I texted you, right? I mean, I kind of said a lot, right? And then I was thinking afterwards, maybe I said too much. I'm not sure. Like I'm sort of, I have these insecurities about that. But what I notice is that there's a possibility out there that I can engage to create a shift. And that possibility for me is to ask the question, why? Why am I thinking about this? Why am I triggered by this, that I'm not getting a response? And I realized through sort of examining that it's because I care about connecting with other people. I care about not offending people. I care about, like building on connections. And so then I say, well, yeah, that's it. And that's a trait that is important to me. And so that allows me to shift from being insecure to realizing that my sort of actions or the way I'm thinking about it is because I care. And that makes me feel better. Mm-hmm. So like, it's sort of like, there's all these little things we can do like that. Just like, I feel like another thing like with possibilities is it's almost like this like flywheel or something, and you're trying to find an understanding, and each scenario is like a click. So you're clicking like, no, that didn't work. So it's like click, 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 click. And then it's like, boom, got it. And then you have this. So it's like, you're taking these different frames of reference, these different views, these different possibilities, and it's connecting dots for you in a way that creates this way of understanding. And in that moment, maybe that doesn't last forever, but in that moment, it just can make you feel better, and it can energize you. And so I'm constantly searching for ways to do that. And so that's like a big part of LIT. It's finding those little on-ramps that can help raise your sort of baseline level of wellness and well-being and energy.
Because you'll react and act from a place you probably want to more often when you're from that place. In reading LIT, you have a deep curiosity, and I'm always interested, like, how are you balancing? I mean, you're also having this lab. I mean, there's other things on the line. You have people who work with you, money, cost, deadlines. There's just a lot to it. And you make it sound easy, but there's a lot. How do you live between kind of caution and creativity? How have you created the tension between those two places? Because a lot of us are there, right? We want to try something. Is that practical? But we want to be creative. We want to try something new. We want to look around the corner. We want to express something. We're trying to stay responsible or cautious or whatever the things are that get told to us. Especially, you get older, then you have a family, then you have a mortgage, whatever those things are that keep us contained. We're caution rules versus creativity.
So I'd say, wow, I love that question. I think what's coming to me is that if I'm just sort of operating alone, right, I'm going to tend to be in this cautious place, and it's going to, I think, make it I might come up with ideas and sort of exercise creativity, but I might be cautious to take a step forward. I may not only be cautious, I may not be motivated to take a step forward. And to me, the key to switching from caution to actionating on creativity and, taking that step forward is to have the right energy of almost constellation of energies with the people around me. And so when that's there and there's this sort of like excitement in the group, then that overcomes the cautiousness, and we're motivated to take bigger risks and start trying things. And then I think the other reason I think that works is because then you have, you know, a neurodiverse team who is then collectively on an adventure to gain insights and look from different perspectives at whatever happens, and you increase your chance of continuing to take the steps forward. Whereas if you're just operating based on your own experiences and wiring, you reduce the chance of being successful, you increase your chance of hitting roadblocks and sort of hitting dead ends that like hitting points that seem like dead ends, but they may not be if you just had the right energies around the table to interpret and sort of energize the situation to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I love that actually. I mean, I told you earlier, we were talking with my daughter, and I'm like, I'm such a team player person, because, you know, there's even days where you're down and people are like, oh, we got this, or you're up and they're not feeling good, and you're like, oh, we got some workarounds, we can figure it out. It is amazing. I always love that when 1 and 1 is 3, there's a magic in that, you know, the real magic of humans and cooperation. I think it's I don't know if there's too many things better than that.
I think one thing about it is that it's always there. Like it's one of the beauties of life is that we can always tap into the collective energy of others, and it feels amazing when you're resonating. And, you know, I mean, it's not always like that. Like sometimes in groups, like we're coming up with ideas and they're not great ideas. Like, you know, they just, you know, kind of brainstorming and things like that. But once we land on something and, you know, there's this, and that's what we look for, is like something where that, and to me, that's also like the beauty of the group, is that you can hash things out and figure out like what really is the best path forward. And not everyone may think it's the best path forward, but everybody's engaged in learning and looking from different angles at the insights that are gained. But I guess what I'm really trying to say is that the beauty of life is that we're not in this alone. We're in this together. And in fact, our wiring, a lot of it is, you know, it's our evolutionary inheritance for tens of thousands of years. We worked as tribes. We worked in villages, working together. And it's very unusual where we are today, you know, where we're, you know, it's a kind of almost like a me-driven society, and where, you know, we live in houses where we may never talk to our neighbors, and there's just, you know, 4 people in a house, for example, whereas we used to be very closely living with 100 people in a village, and everybody's helping each other out in all kinds of different ways. And I feel we don't have to let our current circumstance dictate our present and future. We can actually recognize it and start to make having more collisions with neurodiverse people, you know, constantly in our lives. And I think that leads to all kinds of opportunities. Like you could, I mean, there's so many examples where, you know, you meet somebody new and they have some hobby or some sport, and they're like, hey, come along. Why don't you, you know, like you want to learn how to play this or that, or, you know, and then it creates like, there's all these. And you don't get scared, like if it's something really unknown to you, or you just stay curious and go, I'll just see what happens. Well, I think the fear, as you were saying, the fear gets overridden by the collective energy, right? And so I think that if you're in a place where you're constantly experiencing fear and that's holding you back from taking steps forward, maybe likely what it means is that you're not engaging the collective energy enough. And I think we're wired to do that. Right. So, and when we start doing that, then I think, so that could be a cue, right? That's what we need to do, is we need to get out there and start just interacting more with others, and maybe in particular with people who are different from us and who think differently and who process things differently and can because I just think everything's energy transfer. I really think the whole, like, from the power of the sun, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, right? We have the power of the sun to photosynthesis to all of life, right? And then once we have the beings of life, then they're like, when I was talking about the dogs, like when we were walking and we just make eye contact, there's a transfer of energy there that in some ways is unexplainable. If you think of, we're just electrons and protons and neutrons and just like, right? Like when you think about it at that level, like how is something in the distant causing this energy transfer? Like, it's like, right? It's unbelievable. It's amazing.
Because you have an engineering scientific mind and you've been exposed to these environments, what is your view, and let's just use the word for sake of understanding, we don't have to be literal, of God? Like for you, are you somebody who's like, oh, that's very interesting, but it's really just a bunch of molecules and it's, nothing solid matter and all these things? Is there places in you that you experience the kind of, it's like when they hand you your son, your first child, and here's this baby. For me, I feel this way when I go in nature, and it's like you were saying too, like the intricacies in these small spaces that if you just slow down enough, they blow your mind.
Yeah.
I watched a bee dry itself off. I pulled it out of my pool the other day and I just put it on the side and I watched it dry its wings. You know how fragile and just intricate a wing is, and you're using the legs and wiping off the antennas and stuff. Is there room for you in the awe, not in the analyzing, just in straight awe of what this, life, this experiment, this planet, these relationships? Does it ever just hit you, thunderbolt you?
All the time. All the time. I think like when I'm, but to me, it's a skill. Like we have to practice it because our culture like flattens that. Our culture flattens our imagination and our curiosity and our creativity and, just all kinds of things, atomizes our attention. And I think we can get it back, kind of like this whole resensitizing, approach. So as I try to connect more deeply with my food, as I'm like slowing down to like experience the flavors, as I'm looking outside and trying to focus on individual senses, then that evolves. Everything has a domino effect. So that evolves. And now I look and I see the birds, and the birds are playing. And I was like, well, I never used to see the birds playing, but like I see the birds playing with each other, and the squirrels are playing with each other. Like they're playing games. And there's this whole interaction, like the rabbits are watching the squirrels and the squirrels are watching the birds and the birds are watching for bigger birds. Like there's all sort, and the dogs that I'm walking are looking at everything, And so to me, there's like this amazing, it's like a playground in nature for all the creatures. And yet they're all, trying to survive. Like the trees are, I was in the jungle in Panama and I just, the trees are just trying to reach for the sun. They're just trying to reach for the sun. And there's trees that are just growing and they can't get there, but they're just patiently waiting for a big tree to fall over so that they can grow up. And just going outside and recognizing what's actually happening, how nature's interacting with itself and this life force that's all around us, it's within us. Like this idea that we can go for a bike ride or go surfing or walk or run or whatever it is, and it floods our brain with positive neurotransmitters and we can feel amazing for hours afterwards. And we can access that every day. And there's so many things like that. It's just like movement is one thing, but we're accessing the life force, right? Like that's within us. Like I don't think I mentioned this before, but like in full transparency, there's a new thing I'm practicing. When I go to the bathroom, right? I like to think about my biology, right? Like I like to think about everything that had to happen for, you know, when you eat something and your intestines and peristalsis and the absorption through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, and then the diverse, like, you know, blood vessels we have in all of our tissues, and how the vessels have to get to every single cell, you know, like we have to get the nutrients there, and then the nutrients come out of the vessel and then they go back into the vessels, and then they, you know, there's all these filtering organs that we have. And, you know, to me, it's just, I like to think about that. When I think about that, right, like we're not in control of most of that. It's just happening. And when I think about that, it makes me feel better. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like there's that sense of awe that I'm able to access just sitting on the toilet, right?
Does that inspire you maybe to take care? Because that's how I feel. I always say, is coming from athletics, you get injured enough times that you don't need to learn what a gift feeling good is, because you've had days where you needed help, even getting from, you know, up off the couch across, you know, to the next room. And that the gift in these very quiet things, does that sort of energize you into realizing, like, holy cow, yeah, this in itself is a miracle I get to walk around in. Is it always look the way I want it to look? No. Does it always feel the way? No. You know, it's like we spend most of our time criticizing it and the way we appear in our bodies, and oh, my knee hurts or whatever. But ultimately, maybe those kinds of practices get you into being like, oh, wait, I can also maybe take care of it a little more. You know? Absolutely.
Like even I was cutting a hose a couple months ago, and the knife slipped. I was trying to do it really fast, and you know, usually I'm pretty careful, but I slipped and I cut myself. Pretty bad cut. Yeah. And but like a month later, it's like almost perfectly healed. And so and I feel, again, like that's an opportunity for us to look at that and say, well, what just happened? How did that happen? Like I didn't control that. Like that's incredible. Like we watch the movie Terminator and see how, you know, it gets chopped up and then it reassembles, and we're like, wow, that's amazing. But we have those superpowers, you know, like we have. I've had a lot of sports injuries. I tore my teres major when I was water skiing. I tried to do some crazy thing. I used to teach water skiing when I was at camp, and my grandmother was having her 80th birthday reunion or whatever it was, and I was like, hey, come watch me do all these tricks, and I didn't do them properly, but I tore my teres major, and I went in, and anyhow, it was kind of a long story short, it was one of the most painful experiences of my life, because they had to go in with a spoon because it was already too late and scrape the tissue off the bone so it could reheal. But I did the exercises at home where, like, you know, I couldn't lift this arm. I literally couldn't go above like here. Yeah. Went in, and then the physical therapist gave me the actions to do at home, and you know, I just lie down like this, and then every day a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. Yeah. And it was like, I feel our bodies are designed to heal themselves, to regenerate. Sometimes they just need some cues. They just need to be in a certain position. We just kind of have to help it along in some ways. And I think that's also the placebo effect, right? Big time, right? Because, and I've been reading up on it, and I think there's like a sense that in the hunter-gatherer kind of, you know, times, let's say like go back 10 or 15,000 years ago, and before that, it was like this sort of evolutionary pressure that where it was like, if we believe that the concoction we're putting together or what we're doing, the ritual or the ceremony is helping us, then that actually would help us. If we could believe in it, it would actually help us, and that would help us survive, would help us to live. But we needed some, like, it's like this sort of like, we needed the belief, right? We have to believe. If we don't believe, I think that then nature just kind of eats itself up and regenerates, you know. It just sort of, that's like, if you go into the forest and you're not prepared and you spend enough time there, it's just going to eat you up, you know, like and you're just going to, and not just that, you're going to get regenerated into new life. Like that's what life is all about, is constant regeneration. And so I think the idea is that if we believe, and that's what the placebo effect really is that if you have a belief that what you're getting is going to be helpful and useful for you and have a function, then often it actually will. And there's amazing studies that I've looked at, like stem cell transplants, like where like graft versus host disease, people get bone marrow transplants, very like, you know, it's just terrible. A lot of people die. And for some stem cell therapies, there was a response rate for the placebo, which was just like a saline injection. Like 50% of the patients, it like was cured their graft versus host disease for certain organs. Like it's unbelievable what just positive belief can do. Yeah. And to me, that's tapping into the life force. That's, to me, what God really is like, whether you call it God or I don't personally see God as being male or female, or, you know, I just see sort of like, and a thought came to me on a bike ride a month or two ago, which is nature got itself to the moon. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And that I started thinking, nature wanted to get to the moon before humans existed. Nature wanted to explore the cosmos before humans existed. Nature wanted to explore itself. Humans are just a vessel, a vehicle that nature is using to explore itself, to explore the cosmos, to get to, like, we are nature. We are, you know, and that's why when we go out into nature, we feel so good, because we're experiencing ourselves. We're experiencing what we are.
Yeah, it makes so much sense, nature. When you go there and you can't have a word for it, just makes sense. Like you said, it's like fitting in perfect with it. Do you sleep?
I do. Yeah, no, I sleep.
You do?
I try to sleep.
Does that brain sleep?
Yeah, no, I do sleep. I try to sleep 6.5 hours, but it's kind of gone. Recently it's been creeping a little bit under 6. So yeah, I've been trying to.
And what about entertainment? Do you have the capacity to even watch anything and be like, oh, this is fun, or I'm entertained, or you're like, this is complete dribble? No.
I definitely, I love all the Disney movies that I watch with my kids. I love, you know, I also have I have this belief that, you know, people say you are what you eat. I also feel like you are what you see, consume. What you hear, what you consume. And so I have a tendency to watch like action type things on Netflix, and I've been trying to transition that in an intentional way more to documentaries. So where the focus is more on learning. I'm watching something on Neanderthals now, but I do, you know, I've watched all, you know, the whole Game of Thrones series. I mean, you know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I love watching that. I love watching, you know, I watched a bunch of Netflix documentaries on Roman history, Egyptian history, Japan history, and I'm just fascinated how it's just so similar, the way that humans act. And I do believe that that humans, that we have this, that's not all positive, you know, that we do have this sort of like cruel heart, you know, this aspect, and I've been studying a little bit some of the work of Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist at University of British Columbia, and he's written a number of books and done some amazing documentaries, and he talks about that, and he talks about how culture is really a system of dealing with the cruelness of our heart and sort of implementing strategies and tools to bring out the best in us. And I think that's why history repeats itself, is because if we don't, like, if we live in, as I was saying before, like we're in the snapshot of evolution where we still have our animalistic impulsiveness. And if we live with that, if we let that take over, then it takes us to a negative place. But if we can move more towards consciousness, where we're taking little intentional steps every day and just trying to be open to the cues and be a little bit more deliberate, then that will carry the day, and we will stop repeating history, and we will start, you know, living more interconnectedness with each other and with all of nature, and really raising that baseline of wellness, and, you know, our energy levels, our mood, everything elevates.
I think, like you said, earlier, we are in a transition, which is really uncomfortable because it almost feels like we're breaking an old way and trying to do a new way. And like, will we get there or not is the big question to this consciousness. Because the cruelty is fear, right? It's like, for me, when I see it, I'm like, oh, this person wasn't held and loved and, you know, all of these things. They're really afraid. And so now they're going to punish everybody for that. Well, Jeff, I've already tortured you enough. I really, believe me, I thought about it because I always go long and I was like, oh, poor Jeff Karp. I want to end this with, you say something pretty clearly. It's in your work where you talk about compassion and not living by your label. And I just thought that was something really important to bring up for everyone, because I think when we feel different or we get labeled as something, sometimes people, that becomes something that they wear instead of, what's unique and beautiful and different about them and the way that they'll contribute to the world that we live in. So I just wanted to bring that up because you, for me, are an incredible example of somebody who I know it hasn't been and probably isn't an easy path, but yet, you're generating all this incredible work and tools to help people and, your book and also figuring it out yourself. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for, this has been really I love your questions. I feel, I just, my mind's like kind of racing with all kinds of thoughts. And I mean, on the label in particular, I think labels can be helpful. When I found out I had ADHD, that was actually very helpful for me, to sort of, it was that sort of like clicking of the wheel I was saying. And then it was like, whoa, wait a moment. Like that explains a lot, And, but also it can be very harmful. And I just want to, another shout out to my mom who, I was getting all these labels like, oh, you're lazy, you're not going to amount to much. You're like, they asked me when I was younger, what do you want to be? And I said, a doctor. And they said, you better set your sights lower because you just don't have that, that's not possible. And my mom would just tell me, she's like, no, you have superhero powers like you. And I think at some point I started to believe it. And I just started to kind of play that out in my mind. And when I was being taught various lessons or things in school, like I would sort of think, oh, there's something beyond here. Like there's something different. And even if I couldn't figure it out, I would always think like, maybe I could figure something out that nobody in the class knows, or maybe there's, I was always sort of thinking like that. Like, and it was because of my mom. My mom was just such a big supporter. And I think that a lot of kids like kind of slip through the cracks, and a lot of kids with ADHD have addictions because that's how they try to deal with the the mood and the energy swings and just like the whole thing, and what I think all we really need is just that support to, someone just to kind of hold our hand for a period of time, that especially in elementary school. And my mom was there to do it. And
I think the other thing that always comes up for me is sometimes if someone is different, people who know them will know, like your mother knew you're a smart person, like spend 8 minutes with you and it's like, you'd figure that out. The problem is a lot of people can't get past their own filter. So we're walking around in a world and people are experiencing you through their filter. And so I think that that's really important for everyone to remember. Sometimes the input is through a very different and specific filter. And there's going to be very few people that see us just for the sake of seeing us. And those are great coaches or great parents or great teachers or, friends. And so you're a great example of that. So the book is Lit, L-I-T, Jeff Karp. Thank you. Karp with a K. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you want to learn more, there is a ton of valuable information on my website. All you have to do is go to GabrielleReece.com or head to the episode show notes to find a full breakdown with helpful links to studies, research, books, podcasts, and so much more. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and send them to @GabbyReece on Instagram. And if you feel inspired, please subscribe. I'll see you next week.